June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. Dawn spreads across a horizon thick with fuel haze. On the flight deck of USS Lexington, mechanics tighten bolts under the hum of auxiliary power units. The smell of gasoline mixes with salt air. Dozens of Grumman Hellcats line the deck, folded wings catching the pink light of morning. Beneath the steel decks, engines warm, tools clatter, voices shout in rhythm. Far across the ocean, aboard Japan's flagship Taiho, radio operators lean close to static-filled receivers. Reports flood in, radar contacts countless in number. The officers exchange uneasy glances. Even before the battle begins, they understand what the signals mean. The Americans have come again, and they have come in impossible numbers. Hours later, the sky itself seems filled with aircraft, waves upon waves, machine after machine. For Japan's commanders, the shock is not only tactical, it is industrial, because behind every wing in the sky stands a factory that never sleeps. The horizon has opened. Before a single American bomber crossed the Pacific, the war had already been decided in a place few soldiers ever saw, the factory floor. In the late 1930s, the United States still lived between two worlds, one foot in the Great Depression, the other stepping toward global responsibility. Isolationist sentiment ran deep. The military was small, its air arm little more than an afterthought. In 1939, the Army Air Corps possessed barely 3,000 combat-ready aircraft, many obsolete. Japan, meanwhile, had already conquered large portions of China and was expanding its carrier aviation with alarming precision. Yet America held something invisible but decisive: industrial capacity. The automobile giants, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, had built a system of mass production unmatched on Earth. They could stamp a car body every 55 seconds. They could retool a plant within months. No other nation had such a reservoir of machines, machine tools, and skilled labor standing idle. When Hitler invaded Poland and Europe ignited, President Franklin D. Roosevelt quietly began to move. The world's future, he told advisers, would depend on the great arsenal of democracy. In May 1940, he created the National Defense Advisory Commission, soon replaced by the Office of Production Management, OPM, and later by the War Production Board, bureaucracies that would link Washington's orders to Detroit's presses. A key figure entered the story: William S. Knudsen, president of General Motors. Drafted into government service, he brought the discipline of an assembly line to the chaos of mobilization. He knew that quantity was not an accident. It was a process. He divided aircraft construction into thousands of repeatable steps, subcontracting each to specialists. The dream of aircraft like automobiles began to take shape. Alongside him, General Henry H. Happ. Arnold understood that air power would decide the next war. He toured plants, spoke to foremen, inspected test benches. Every order he signed carried the same message: more airframes, more engines, faster. "We can lose battles," Arnold told Congress in 1940, "but if we lose production, we lose the war." Even before Pearl Harbor, the groundwork was laid. The civilian pilot training program expanded the pipeline of flyers. Universities turned classrooms into hangars. Congress funded airfields and training commands across the South and West. The Army Air Force's Technical Command began cataloging every bolt and gasket, building the logistics DNA that would later feed tens of thousands of planes. In Japan, the picture was starkly different. The island empire had engineers of brilliance, but its industrial base was narrow. Aluminum, oil, and high-octane fuel were imported. Factories were dispersed, often artisanal, producing aircraft almost by hand. Mitsubishi and Nakajima could design world-class fighters, but could not build them in mass quantities. Tokyo's military planners believed the next war must be short, decisive, and fought before American industry could awaken. By 1941, that assumption guided everything. Japan's leaders approved the southern advance toward the Dutch East Indies, seeking oil and metals for the war they knew would come. And in Washington, Roosevelt pressed forward regardless of politics. In September 1940, he announced the 50,000 planes a year goal, a number so vast that newspapers mocked it. Knudsen did not laugh. He went to work. Auto engineers redesigned plants for aviation tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Machine tool companies multiplied capacity. The Ford Motor Company undertook a project that symbolized the era, Willow Run, a mile-long factory in Michigan dedicated to building B-24 Liberators on a moving line. At its peak, one bomber would roll out every hour. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, that machinery roared to life. Production orders tripled overnight. Thousands of subcontractors, radio makers, refrigerator firms, piano factories were absorbed into the supply chain. America had entered total mobilization, and as the Pacific burned, a new kind of battlefield emerged, measured not in miles gained, but in rivets driven. The United States was about to prove that industrial planning could be a weapon more decisive than any bomb. Factories now thunder day and night. The challenge becomes scale itself. By 1942, the United States had transformed itself into the largest industrial mobilization effort in human history. What began as emergency planning had become a symphony of steel, fuel, and labor. Every town seemed to hum with the rhythm of war production. Riveters, machinists, welders, and inspectors working around the clock under the glow of sodium lamps. A single figure captures that transformation: 100,000 aircraft in 1 year. In 1939, American factories produced fewer than 3,000 planes. 5 years later, they would roll out that number every 10 days. The key was organization. The War Production Board, WPB, created in early 1942, directed the economy like a central nervous system. It allocated materials, set priorities, and synchronized the output of hundreds of thousands of firms. Each B-17 bomber drew parts from 1,500 suppliers. Each P-51 Mustang required aluminum from Arkansas, rubber from Ohio, instruments from Connecticut, and a Merlin engine license built by Packard in Detroit. Henry Kaiser, the shipbuilding magnate, taught aviation executives how to build on parallel lines, constructing new plants while producing within old ones. Standardization became gospel: interchangeable rivets, color-coded wiring, quick-release panels. Engineers learned to trade aesthetic perfection for speed. A finished aircraft could now be rolled to the edge of a runway, fueled, tested, and flown to a combat zone within days. America's strength was not only material, but logistical imagination. New production cities rose overnight: Fort Worth for bombers, Renton for flying boats, Long Beach for cargo planes. Women filled the gaps left by men at war, nearly 1 million of them by 1943. Welding, riveting, calibrating instruments, their work immortalized by Rosie the Riveter. Their precision rivaled any craftsman's energy, and raw material bottlenecks were anticipated and crushed. Synthetic rubber replaced imports from Southeast Asia. Aluminum output soared with the opening of massive hydroelectric dams along the Columbia River. Aviation gasoline production multiplied as refineries converted to 100-octane blends. The result was a chain reaction. By 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces had grown from a few thousand aircraft to more than 80,000 in inventory. Training fields across Texas, Arizona, and California churned out pilots in waves. The Navy, too, surged. Its new Essex-class carriers, each capable of launching nearly 100 planes. The replacement rate defied comprehension. What Japan lost in a month, America could replace in days. In Tokyo, alarm bells rang. Japanese naval intelligence units collected intercepted data and aerial reconnaissance photographs of American shipyards. Each report told the same story: new hulls on every slipway, endless lines of aircraft at coastal depots. By late 1943, staff officers at the Imperial General Headquarters privately conceded that Japan could no longer match U.S. output in any category of war material. But the most shocking figures arrived with combat reports. After the battles of Guadalcanal and Santa Cruz, Japanese commanders noted that American squadrons reappeared with uncanny speed. Destroyed units were refitted and returned in weeks. Factories thousands of miles away were replacing the losses before the smoke had cleared from the battlefield. One surviving memorandum from 1944 by Rear Admiral Ugaki Matomi described the realization bluntly: the enemy air power is inexhaustible. To shoot one down is meaningless. 10 rise in its place. The industrial contest had become a war of endurance, and Japan had no margin left. Its aircraft plants at Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokosuka were working at full strain, yet fuel shortages and Allied bombing had begun to choke them. Skilled workers were drafted into the army. Replacements came from schoolboys and untrained laborers. The production gap widened not arithmetically, but exponentially. Still, for all the statistics, the story was more than numbers. It was the product of vision, organization, and relentless execution, the human machinery behind the mechanical one. And that is where the true depth of this transformation reveals itself, in the engineers, the strategists, the laborers, and the airmen who lived within it. Their collective effort became not just an economic miracle, but a new way of fighting a war, one measured in mass, rhythm, and precision. Engel, industrial mobilization, the arsenal comes alive. The United States did not merely build factories, it built a civilization around them. By 1942, entire landscapes had turned metallic. Smokestacks piercing morning fog, the hiss of acetylene torches echoing through vast hangars. The language of war changed from tactics to throughput. A colonel might speak not of divisions, but of production quotas. Detroit led the way. Once an automotive city, it became the arsenal of democracy. Its engineers translated crankshafts into propellers, gearboxes into gun turrets. Ford's Willow Run plant, a mile-long cathedral of assembly, became the symbol of this new faith in machinery. Over 8,600 B-24 Liberator bombers emerged from its lines, each a flying factory of 1.5 million parts. What made this possible was an unprecedented collaboration between government and private enterprise. Executives, labor leaders, and generals sat at the same tables, arguing, planning, compromising, producing. Rival companies shared patents. Designers standardized parts across brands that had once competed. The goal was not profit. It was output per hour. For many workers, the factory was a front line. Accidents, exhaustion, and relentless noise became part of their service. They worked with a sense of urgency bordering on reverence. In diaries, foremen wrote that production felt like a second battlefield, where every rivet driven was a blow against fascism. This was how the impossible number, 100,000 planes a year, became plausible. America had discovered that industrial discipline, once applied to comfort, could be repurposed for survival. Angle B, logistics and fuel, the invisible army know. Aircraft could fight without the silent army of ships, pipelines, and fuel depots behind it. Here too, American planning achieved the extraordinary. The same logistical genius that fed assembly lines now reached across oceans. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks, assisted by the newly formed Seabees, built entire airfields in weeks, coral runways carved out of jungles, hangars rising from volcanic ash. Tankers crisscrossed the Pacific, bringing 100-octane aviation gasoline to forward bases like Ulithi and Manus. New innovations such as fleet oilers allowed carriers to refuel at sea, extending their reach far beyond Japan's expectations. Japan, by contrast, was trapped by geography. Its empire stretched thin across islands and continents, dependent on vulnerable sea lanes for oil and bauxite. Submarine warfare and aerial mining slowly constricted those arteries. By 1944, Japanese pilots trained on a fraction of the fuel their American counterparts burned in a single week. The difference was not only strategic, it was existential. American airmen could afford to make mistakes, to practice, to refine. Japanese pilots, short on fuel and time, flew straight from the classroom to combat. Every gallon of gasoline, every drum of lubricating oil, every crate of spare parts represented victory long before a single bullet was fired. The logistical map became a new kind of front line, one the Americans dominated completely. Angle C, training pipelines. Factories for pilots' machines alone could not win a war. Men had to master them. General Hap Arnold understood this with the precision of an engineer. He built training as if it were production, standardized, measured, repeatable. Across the American South and West, new airfields appeared overnight. From Randolph Field in Texas to Luke Field in Arizona, cadets poured in by the tens of thousands. Training was modular, primary, basic, advanced. If a pilot failed at one stage, another replaced him immediately. The throughput was relentless. By 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces were graduating 7,000 pilots a month. Simultaneously, mechanics and armorers trained in parallel schools, ensuring that every crew reaching a combat zone could maintain its aircraft independently. Even psychological screening became systematic. American command realized that consistent, confident pilots, not just gifted ones, would sustain operations year after year. Japan's system, rooted in pre-war elitism, could not adapt. Its veteran pilots, highly skilled but irreplaceable, were lost faster than they could be trained. When they fell, so did the nation's aerial experience. By 1943, the gap was irreversible. One country had built a production line for competence. The other had built a pyramid of brilliance resting on too few shoulders. The skies were about to reveal that difference with ruthless clarity. Factories roared, fuel flowed, pilots assembled. But the full weight of this machine had yet to meet its enemy head-on. The next stage would show how technology, leadership, and morale turn numbers into dominance. Angle D, technology and standardization, the mechanics of supremacy. The greatest American advantage was not any single airplane. It was standardization, a quiet revolution in engineering that multiplied every gain. Factories were designed like orchestras, sub-assemblies flowing on timed schedules, tools calibrated to within microns, mechanics able to replace any part with another drawn from 1,000 miles away. A wing spar from Kansas fit a fuselage from California without modification. That reliability turned logistics into science. Key innovations made this possible. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, built for ruggedness rather than delicacy, powered both the P-47 Thunderbolt and the F-6F Hellcat. Mechanics could swap engines in the field, knowing the parts would align. Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engines gave the P-51 Mustang range deep into Germany and later across the Pacific. Technological cross-pollination accelerated because the U.S. could afford experimentation. Radar sets, radio beacons, and bomb sites rolled off lines as predictably as spark plugs. Quality control inspectors, many of them women trained in metrology, measured every surface, ensuring consistency no handcrafting could match. In Japan, aircraft design brilliance clashed with material poverty. The Zero fighter was agile but fragile, its light frame dependent on scarce high-grade aluminum. Late-war Japanese planes built from inferior alloys and untested substitutes deteriorated after a few flights. The difference was not ingenuity, it was supply chain physics. Technology, once standardized, became scalable, and scalability turned into strategy. Angle E, leadership and planning. Minds behind the machine numbers alone meant nothing without the vision to wield them. Here the United States produced a cadre of leaders who treated logistics as strategy itself. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, understood that control of the air required control of production. His daily briefings tracked factory output as closely as combat reports. When an engine shortage threatened operations, he diverted resources instantly, sometimes phoning industrialists directly. His motto was simple: no pause, no bottleneck, no excuse. Across the Pacific, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and Admiral Raymond Spruance turned that abundance into momentum. They fought not for territory, but for position, seizing islands to build new airfields and carrier anchorages, each within the protective umbrella of replenishment ships. When a carrier took damage, replacements were already en route. This continuous tempo stunned Japanese commanders. Their strategy relied on decisive battles, quick, overwhelming blows that would break the enemy's will. But against Nimitz and Arnold's system, there was no single decisive blow to strike. The American war machine regenerated faster than it could be destroyed. The synergy between planning and production made the Pacific War less a series of battles and more a rolling industrial tide. Slow, heavy, unstoppable. Angle F, enemy perception and morale. The moment of realization for Japan's high command. Understanding came not from espionage, but from experience. By mid-1943, battle reports no longer followed the expected pattern. Where once each engagement had depleted American strength, now the reverse was true. After every confrontation, more American planes appeared than before. Japanese pilots described it in chilling detail. At the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, they saw formations of bombers arriving in perfect timing, their escorts overlapping waves. At Bougainville, they faced carrier groups that replenished aircraft mid-operation. Endless, one surviving pilot called them. The enemy skies are endless. Morale cracked from the top down. Some officers blamed intelligence failures, others divine fate. But internal memoranda revealed the truth. Japan had underestimated the industrial depth of its opponent. By 1944, captured American reports began circulating among Japanese analysts. Production charts showing tens of thousands of airframes and engines per quarter. It cannot be true, one colonel wrote, that a nation can replace an air fleet every year. Yet it was true, and worse, the replacement fleets were better trained, better armed and more numerous each month. Psychologically, this realization was devastating. Veterans began to speak of the Black Sea of American planes, a sky so crowded that daylight itself seemed weaponized. From Tokyo's war rooms to island garrisons, officers now understood the arithmetic of defeat. Japan's courage and discipline could not bridge an industrial gulf. Measured in millions of man-hours, the moral victory Japan sought through sacrifice was dissolving into mathematical certainty. By late 1943, the elements had converged: technology, leadership, and psychology. But it would take one decisive confrontation to make the scale undeniable. A battle where Japan's finest air arm met the full force of America's industrial sky. The sky turns to steel. June 1944. By the summer of 1944, Japan's pilots had one last hope: to halt the American advance before it reached the homeland. Their airfields in the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, formed the outer wall of Japan's Pacific fortress. If those islands fell, American bombers could strike Tokyo itself. The Imperial Navy assembled what remained of its carrier air strength, 9 carriers. Wore out 30 planes and hundreds of pilots, many hastily trained. Facing them were 15 American carriers, 900 aircraft, and a logistical armada so vast that even the admirals lost count of the ships accompanying it. At dawn on June 19, 1944, radar screens aboard USS Lexington, Yorktown, and Enterprise flickered to life. Blips crowded the scopes, enemy raids inbound from the west. Controllers coolly vectored the interceptors. All stations, one officer noted in the log, launch everything. Moments later, the Pacific erupted into thunder. The industrial war takes flight. The first Japanese wave, 69 aircraft, met a sky thick with American Hellcats. Pilots described it as flying into a wall. Radar guidance, radio coordination, and disciplined formations shattered the uncoordinated enemy attacks. In the space of an hour, more than half the incoming planes were destroyed. Then came another wave. Then another. And another. Each met the same fate. American pilots, many on their second or third combat tour, flew machines that could outclimb, outdive, and outabsorb damage from every Japanese aircraft in service. The F-6F Hellcat's 2,000 horsepower engine could take hits that would have shredded the fragile Zero. The kill ratio defied belief. Nearly 350 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of only 30 Americans. Carrier decks filled with the smell of burnt fuel and victory. Pilots returning from sorties reported seeing the ocean littered with flames. It was like shooting turkeys, one said, giving the battle its grim nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. A battle of numbers, not just skill, but the battle was more than a slaughter in the sky. It was the visible proof of an invisible equation, production versus depletion. Every Japanese pilot lost that day was irreplaceable. Every American pilot lost had a trained replacement already waiting. Every destroyed Zero meant one fewer machine that Japan's limited aluminum stockpile could never rebuild. The Americans, by contrast, could lose entire squadrons and replace them within weeks. In the United States, 35,000 aircraft were already rolling off assembly lines in the first half of 1944 alone. Replacement parts were stacked in depots from Pearl Harbor to Brisbane. The Pacific Fleet no longer fought in campaigns, it fought in cycles of replenishment. Rear Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet, watched from the bridge of his carrier Taiho as the reports came in. Wave after wave wiped out. His pilots, many barely 100 hours trained, had flown bravely, but they had flown into the jaws of a machine that manufactured both planes and experience faster than any empire could resist. When Taiho herself was struck by a torpedo and her fuel vapors ignited, the flagship exploded, a literal symbol of Japan's collapsing air arm, the carriers that never slept. Meanwhile, on the American side, the tempo never slowed. Carriers cycled planes like clockwork. Fuel lines hissed, catapults fired, ordnance crews worked knee-deep in shell casings. The sound was endless, a mechanical heartbeat echoing across the Pacific. Behind the front line, hundreds of support ships formed a floating base. Tankers, repair ships, ammunition barges, hospital vessels. Aircraft carriers returned to operations within hours of damage. The Enterprise, struck by a kamikaze months later, would be repaired and back at sea in just 60 days. Japan, by contrast, would take years to replace a single carrier, if it could replace it at all. Observers later noted that this was not merely a victory of men or machines, but of organization itself. A system that could sustain constant synchronized motion across thousands of miles was more powerful than any weapon. The moment of realization. By the evening of June 20th, 1944, the sky had cleared. The American pilots returned, many landing in darkness after the longest carrier strikes in history. Below them, burning ships marked the horizon. Japanese headquarters in Tokyo received the final reports. Almost the entire first-line air group annihilated, pilots lost, carriers crippled or sunk. The shock among staff officers was quiet, almost reverent, as if they were witnessing not defeat, but revelation. The impossible had become visible. America could destroy Japan's air power faster than Japan could rebuild it. It was not a battle. It was a measurement of production. The Pacific had become a laboratory of industrial warfare. Yet even after this disaster, Japan continued to fight. With dwindling planes, scarcer fuel, and a new, desperate tactic waiting to emerge, from superiority to supremacy, the Battle of the Philippine Sea had ended any illusion of balance. Japan's elite airmen were gone, its carriers stripped of aircraft, its industry falling behind at a pace that defied comprehension. The Imperial Navy, once the world's most modern force, had become a fleet without wings. Within weeks, American planners pushed forward with confidence that bordered on inevitability. The Marianas Islands were secured, and construction crews, the Navy's Seabees, immediately began carving out runways long enough for heavy bombers. Within months, B-29 superfortresses were taking off toward Tokyo. Each of those bombers represented industrial convergence. 4 2,200-horsepower engines, 10 crew, and over 60,000 individual components. The B-29 program alone employed hundreds of thousands of workers across dozens of states. It was, in essence, a flying city, and the United States was producing them by the thousands. For Japan's commanders, the sight of these new machines, vast, silver, and untouchable at high altitude, confirmed what the Philippine Sea had already revealed. America could outproduce time itself. The Strategic Bombing Offensive, the Sitpun Bomber Command, under General Curtis LeMay, began its campaign in late 1944. Early high-altitude missions proved ineffective due to jet stream winds, but LeMay's solution was as brutal as it was efficient: low-altitude night bombing with incendiaries. On March 9–10, 1945, Tokyo burned. In 6 hours, 334 B-29s dropped 1,700 tons of firebombs, turning 16 square miles of the capital into ash. Over 100,000 people perished. For Japanese leaders, the horror was not only human, it was industrial. The aircraft losses on the American side were negligible. While one city burned, new planes were already rolling off production lines back home. Factories across Japan vanished beneath waves of fire. Kawasaki, Nakajima, Mitsubishi, names once synonymous with innovation, were reduced to skeleton frames. Aircraft output dropped by half between January and June. 1945, the entire aviation infrastructure that had taken 2 decades to build was collapsing month by month, yet from the ashes rose a new weapon, one born not of industry, but of desperation, the kamikaze response in October 1944. As American forces invaded the Philippines, Japan introduced the kamikaze, or divine wind, attacks. Lacking the resources to replace lost pilots and planes, the Imperial Navy turned to suicide tactics. It was a grim acknowledgement that production could no longer sustain the war. These were not fanatics, as often portrayed. Many were young men who understood exactly what they were doing. They flew outdated fighters loaded with explosives against a fleet that could lose ships and replace them. While Japan could not lose a single aircraft without consequence, American sailors soon realized the scale of the tragedy. For every kamikaze plane that struck, a dozen others were shot down long before impact. Each represented not only a life lost, but an admission. Japan's skies had become a one-way road. Even as kamikazes struck the Franklin, Bunker Hill, and Enterprise, repair crews worked around the clock. Damaged carriers returned to service within weeks, replenished by reserve air groups and endless shipments of spare parts. Japan's sacrifice, though fierce, could not dent the momentum of a nation that built new fleets as fast as old ones burned. The final industrial blow-by, early 1945, Japan's aircraft production had fallen below 1,000 units per month. In contrast, American plants were still producing more than 7,000, even as victory approached. The Pacific Fleet now operated 28 major carriers and more than 100 escort carriers. Fuel flowed from vast tanker networks. Spare engines filled warehouses from Pearl Harbor to Guam. The Imperial General Headquarters received intelligence summaries that bordered on despair. One report from March 1945 estimated that the enemy's aircraft production now exceeds our entire stockpile of fuel. Another concluded bluntly, continued resistance is no longer a question of strategy, but of faith. Meanwhile, American B-29s extended their reach deeper into Japan's industrial heartland. Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe fell to firebombing. Operation Starvation, the aerial mining of Japan's coastal waters, sealed the country's fate by cutting maritime supply routes. Fuel vanished, factories stopped, and flight training ceased altogether. Japanese pilots resorted to taxiing aircraft down runways simply to give trainees a feel for movement. By the summer of 1945, the skies over Japan were unchallenged. The U.S. Army Air Forces controlled the daylight. The Navy controlled the night. The Empire's once mighty air arm had become a memory, erased not by a single battle, but by arithmetic, the end of the sky when the atomic bombs fell in August 1945. Japan had fewer than 1,000 operational aircraft left, many grounded for lack of fuel. The arsenal of democracy had delivered its verdict. America had produced more aircraft in 1 month than Japan could now field in total. From Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima, the balance had never been one of courage. Both sides had that in abundance, but of sustainability. The factories of Detroit, Seattle, and Wichita had decided the fate of empires. The Pacific War had begun with surprise in the sky. It ended with silence there. The machine had completed its purpose. What remained was reckoning, to measure what such production had cost, and what it meant for the world now entering peace. The arithmetic of victory in the aftermath of Japan's surrender. Statisticians, engineers, and officers on both sides began to compile their final reports. The figures told a story more devastating than any explosion. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced over 300,000 military aircraft. Factories that had never built a single plane before the war had turned out thousands. Ford's Willow Run alone delivered 8,600 B-24 bombers. Douglas produced 29,000 C-47 transports. Grumman, Republic, and North American churned out fighters in such volume that storage depots overflowed. In 1944 alone, the U.S. built more aircraft than Japan, Germany, and Italy combined. Japan's total wartime production was just over 76,000 aircraft, of which nearly half were destroyed before ever reaching combat. Aluminum shortages, power outages, and Allied bombing crippled the remainder. By 1945, output had collapsed to a trickle. But numbers alone miss the deeper truth: sustainability. America not only built machines, it kept them flying. Every plane carried an infrastructure behind it: replacement engines, spare propellers, maintenance manuals, trained ground crews, supply depots, fuel refineries, transport ships, and the engineers to keep them all synchronized. When a B-29 landed damaged, teams stripped it, replaced the fuselage sections, and returned it to service within days. Japanese mechanics, often working under open skies, lacked tools, materials, even replacement tires. Their planes aged faster than they could be repaired. This disparity extended to the human level. The United States trained more than 600,000 aircrew members during the war: pilots, gunners, bombardiers, navigators, radio operators, and mechanics. Japan, by contrast, trained fewer than 40,000, many of them in shortened courses under fuel restrictions. The result was a complete inversion of power. By 1944, an American pilot entering combat had logged nearly 250 flight hours. His Japanese counterpart might have fewer than 100. Economic and material fallout. The material cost of this victory was staggering. The American economy had mobilized 17 million workers, converted 200,000 factories, and consumed half the world's oil production. Yet in doing so, it emerged stronger than before. Industrial output at war's end was double what it had been in 1939. Japan, however, stood in ruins. Its cities were rubble, its ports clogged with wreckage, its transport grid shattered. The same precision that had once produced Zero fighters now lay, buried under ash. Post-war inspections by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey found that 60% of Japan's aircraft factories had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Many of the remaining buildings had no roofs, their machines rusting in the rain. The survey concluded that even without the atomic bombs, Continued blockade and bombing would have forced surrender within months, not from morale collapse, but from total industrial paralysis. In these ruins, a grim understanding dawned among surviving Japanese officers. Their defeat had been written not only in tactics or courage, but in production ratios. They had fought a war of craftsmanship against a war of mass manufacture, and craftsmanship, for all its skill, could not multiply. The human cost behind the statistics were millions of human stories. American assembly line workers who never saw battle but carried scars of exhaustion. Japanese civilians who dug bomb shelters beside assembly sheds. Engineers who watched their blueprints turned into fire and smoke. In Tokyo, in the ruins of the Nakajima Musashino plant, a group of surviving engineers gathered in September 1945. Among the twisted aluminum lay an untouched drafting table. On it was a pencil note left by a worker before the final raid. "Build faster, they are coming, they had come." And they had come in numbers too great for any empire to resist. The machines were silent now, but the questions they raised were not. What would this new industrial age mean for peace? Could nations harness such power without turning it again to destruction? Those questions marked the next chapter, lessons in power and production. When the smoke cleared, two truths remained. First, industrial capacity had become the decisive currency of war. Second, no nation could ever fight a total conflict again without mastering the mathematics of supply. In Washington, the War Department's analysts pored over the figures with quiet awe. Production, they realized, had not merely supported strategy, it was strategy. The ability to build faster than the enemy could destroy had turned logistics into a weapon more powerful than any bomb. General Hap Arnold, in his 1946 report to Congress, put it plainly: victory in the air was the product of the assembly line as much as the cockpit. The lesson is eternal. Industry must be ready before the first shot is fired. Factories that had once produced bombers now turned out automobiles, refrigerators, and peacetime machines. Wartime research accelerated peacetime progress, from metallurgy to radar to jet propulsion. The industrial surge had reshaped America itself, giving birth to a new middle class, powered by the very technology that had once armed its bombers. Yet beneath the prosperity was unease. The same capacity that had built fleets and cities could now destroy them faster than ever. The atomic age was born directly from the assembly lines of total war. Japan's reconstruction for Japan. Defeat became transformation. Under the Allied occupation, the ruins of its aviation industry were dismantled, but its engineering spirit survived. Former aircraft factories like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Nakajima's successor, Fuji, redirected their precision to automobiles, cameras, and electronics. What had once built Zero fighters would now build the engines of peace: Toyota trucks, Nikon lenses, Sony radios. Ironically, the same discipline that had sustained wartime production would fuel Japan's post-war recovery. By the 1960s, the nation that once could not match America's output had become an industrial power in its own right. Odyssey d'Odysseus, this time wielding mass production as an instrument of reconstruction rather than conquest. The lessons learned in defeat became the foundation of a new economy: efficiency, standardization, and quality control. Japan's engineers studied American production systems and perfected them. Within 2 decades, the names Mitsubishi and Toyota once again stood for excellence. But now their products carried no insignia of war. A new doctrine for the world for military planners everywhere. World War II had rewritten doctrine. Air superiority was no longer a matter of bravery or skill alone. It depended on the capacity to build, maintain, and replace. Every future conflict would be fought not only on battlefields, but in factories and laboratories. The Cold War that followed became an arms race of production lines and supply chains. Jet bombers, missiles, and nuclear submarines were born from the same logic that once created 100,000 aircraft a year. The superpowers no longer measured strength by soldiers in the field, but by output on the factory floor. The Japanese commanders, who had once watched the sky fill with American bombers, would have recognized the pattern instantly. War had become a contest of economies and peace, its uneasy continuation. The human memory, when American occupation officers toured Japan's ruined airfields in 1946, they found skeletons of once mighty aircraft lying in rice paddies and hangars turned into shelters. Some carried slogans still painted on their fuselages, "For the Emperor." Others were stripped for metal by starving civilians. In a report to Washington, one colonel wrote, "The aircraft graveyards of Japan are not monuments to failure but to courage. They remind us that men fought beyond the limits of industry, and that in the end, industry sets the limits." The war's conclusion was both triumph and warning. Humanity had proven it could mobilize entire civilizations for destruction. The challenge of the future would be to mobilize them for endurance, for peace. The war of machines was over, but its echo remained in every factory, every flight, every quiet calculation of power. The question that lingered was no longer who could build more, but what we would choose to build next. Dawn rises again over the Pacific. The same light that once glinted on wings of war now falls quietly over cities rebuilt from their ashes. In the stillness, the story of those 100,000 airplanes no longer feels like statistics. It feels like a measure of human will, both creative and destructive. During the war, the sound of engines was the sound of survival. Every propeller that turned, every rivet struck, was a heartbeat in an industrial organism larger than any nation before it. The United States had proven that a society could transform itself into a single, coordinated machine, one capable of building faster than it could be destroyed. But victory carried a paradox. For Japan, the defeat was total, yet within that defeat lay the seeds of rebirth. From the ruins of its factories rose an economy that would, within a generation, rival the very nation that once overwhelmed it. The engineers who had built Zero fighters built the machines of peace. The hands that had riveted bombers now assembled radios, automobiles, and cameras. And for America, triumph demanded introspection. The arsenal that had secured freedom had also revealed how easily human invention could eclipse human restraint. From those same foundries that built the B-29 came the first atomic bomb, proof that production without moral limits could create power beyond comprehension. When historians speak of World War II, they often count the battles, the weapons, the empires that fell. But the truer story lies elsewhere. In the men and women who turned wrenches through sleepless nights, who measured steel in thousandths of an inch, who believed that their labor could end tyranny. Theirs was a quiet kind of heroism, one without medals or parades, the courage of persistence. Because in the end, war is not won by machines alone. It is won and remembered by the hands that build them, and the conscience that decides when to stop. History isn't just made on battlefields, it's built in the factories, in the hangars, in the hands of those who never fired a shot. If this story moved you, don't let it fade into silence. Subscribe for more true cinematic World War II documentaries. Every week, another forgotten chapter reborn in film. Like, share, and help us keep history alive, one story at a time.